Yeah. Yeah. And so this idea of, and I wanted to go back. So this idea of differently educated women, different social classes having different experiences on the dating apps. Well, they're also having entirely different experiences in the real world too, in terms of their dating and romantic relationships after the erosion of marriage, after the sort of deteriorating norms around dating and romance. If, I talked to some people from my hometown, for example, and I think about, the kinds of guys who stayed behind, who didn't go off to college, who didn't join the military, who just sort of languished and hung around there. These are not, just to put it bluntly, these are not, it's not Prince Charming. And so when women are dating these men and there's no social norms, no forces constraining them, many of them act very poorly. A lot of alcoholism, a lot of drug use, verbal and sometimes physical abuse, emotional abuse. A lot of these guys who sort of are not so educated, don't have a lot of money, not a lot of life prospects, when they get involved with a woman, they don't necessarily treat her very well. Whereas, in the past, I think that there were stronger norms around how you're supposed to treat the opposite sex and how you're supposed to interact with them, date them, what's expected of you, and so on. I think with the sort of dissolution of expectations has come a lot more trouble for lower income young women.
Yeah, hypothetically, the ones that the progressives are trying to do something for. Removing the constraints of patriarchal relationships, for example. The question always is, what flows in when you remove the dikes, right? I mean, that's another problem, I suppose, in some sense, that's analogous to the protection of social class, is many of these institutions that are so casually criticized, we don't know what forces shape them. So, I've been pilloried in the press repeatedly for pointing out that normative monogamy controls male aggression. Now, it's amazing to me that I've been slashed to ribbons for making that case, because I thought that was like Anthropology 101. So, there's two things that every society needs to control, and one is female fecundity because of its high cost, and the other is male aggression. It's like, well, I thought everyone knew that if they were even moderately educated. And, well, how do you control that? Regulate it for everyone's interest, particularly for the interest of children. The answer seems to be the imposition of monogamous norms. Now, people object, well, are people truly monogamous? And the answer is not if you set up the environment to differentially award hyper-successful polyamorous males, which is exactly what Tinder does. And there are societies where that's the case, where one man has 1,000 wives, so to speak, and 999 men have none. But those aren't societies that are stable, and those young men who have nothing to do find things to do, and they aren't necessarily the sorts of things that you want them to be doing. Because what the hell do they have to lose, fundamentally? And it's not a good idea to generate a society full of young men who have very little to lose. So, and it is an appalling thing that the privileged classes are more likely to disparage marriage, let's say.
And these ideas trickle down over time. They sort of permeate throughout society because elites, affluent, educated people wield disproportionate influence, whether it's through media, pop culture, fashion.
Do you know, here's something cool.
Yeah.
So do you know that names drift down the social hierarchy?
Huh. I haven't heard this before.
Influential upper class people will produce a name for their child, and then that name gets popularized all the way down the social hierarchy until it becomes passé, and becomes more and more common as it drifts down. So this influence that you're describing, you can measure it everywhere. They're the fashion leaders. They're on the cutting edge, and everyone imitates. And so
yes. And I think that, so, of course, like actual fashion, clothing, of course, the sort of trendsetters, and then it trickles down to everyone else. I didn't know this about names, which is really interesting, but I think it is also for sort of moral beliefs as well. One idea that I've sort of been playing with, maybe this is, a little bit dangerous for me to say, but I've been thinking about this, who is championing sort of colorblindness, integration, this idea that, we should treat everyone on their merits and so on. I mean, whatever, 50 or 60 years ago, this was a very progressive idea, and it was mostly championed by highly educated people, more affluent people. They also tended to lead the abolitionist movement in the US and so on. But more recently, things have changed. So my idea here is that in the past, the elites had this idea of colorblindness. Over time, that idea trickled throughout society, such that now today, if you talk to a typical middle class or working class Western person, they do tend to basically believe in colorblindness. The racial attitudes are basically like, who cares? And it's not an important thing in their lives. And so now that the elites have spread this belief, how do they once again distinguish themselves from the hoi polloi, from those middle and working class people? They once again have to make race an important feature of our social reality.
So
now
I got to comment about your theory there for a sec, if you don't mind.
Sure.
When Francis Galton, 150 years ago, started studying, he thought about it as excellence, something like that. I mean, some of the IQ research came out of that. He started to measure people on a whole variety of different dimensions. But his conception of excellence, of superiority, let's say, wasn't so much cognitive capacity, the more differentiated sorts of things that we might measure today and associate with some degree of value: conscientiousness, creativity, intelligence. Galton, who was an English aristocrat, which is the reason I'm bringing this up, was at the forefront of that movement. And he believed, like most English aristocrats of his time, that England was a superior culture and that English aristocrats were the hallmark of English superiority, right? And so, but that superiority was fundamentally, I would say, moral. That the superiority that was being searched for wasn't economic, exactly. That the economic superiority was an indicator of the moral superiority. And so, and that would be associated, yes. So that would be associated with something like moral purity and associated with disgust. Now, George Orwell talked about, because he was from relatively higher social status, I think he was upper middle class, but he said he had a visceral distaste of the working class. And he had to overcome that. And he did. He worked in restaurants and he worked in all sorts of jobs. He went to war. I mean, Orwell strove to overcome that visceral disgust. And disgust is, the opposite of disgust is purity. And that's associated with a kind of moral superiority. And so one of the things that one of the ideas that your concept brings up is the notion that the central axis of social hierarchy is something like a